Welcome back to Brigham Young University's online economics course. Up to now we've talked about supply, demand, a little bit about elasticity, and really about how the price system works, how we can use prices to change what we supply and change what we demand. Today we're going to talk about where the price system fails. We call those market failures. So let's go through a chapter outline and just identify what things we're going to hit today and what things you're going to need to be able to make sure that you understand. First thing is what a price system can and cannot do. The second one is correcting for externalities. Third, the other economic functions of government. Fourth, the political functions of government. Fifth, public spending and transfer programs. And sixth, collective decision making, the act of voting, the theory of public choice. So let's get into it. What a price system can and cannot do. In its most ideal form, a price system allows resources, or land, labor, and capital, to move from lower valued to higher valued uses. And it does that through the market, through this voluntary exchange that we've talked about. Economic efficiency arises when all mutually advantageous trades have taken place. There are, however, situations where the price system does not generate the desired results. In those situations, government feels that it has a role, and it steps in with the intent of mitigating the weaknesses or the failures of the market. So anytime the market doesn't allocate these resources effectively or efficiently, that's a market failure. And sometimes the market is remedied, or those market failures are remedied, by some actions of government. Over the last few years, you've seen some fairly extraordinary interventions by government in the market. These interventions typically are fairly mild, but when we have crises, economic or financial, the government feels like they have a role in stepping in and mitigating disasters that could otherwise occur. What is a market failure? It's nothing more than a situation in which the unrestrained or unregulated market economy leads to either too few or too many resources going to a specific economic activity. Market failures by their nature prevent economic efficiency and also prevent individual freedom. Market failures can be addressed by public policy, by government intervention. In their pure market systems, economic efficiency occurs when individuals know and must bear the true opportunity cost of their actions. Now remember what opportunity cost means. The opportunity cost is the cost of the thing that you didn't do. So your opportunity cost of being in this lecture or listening to this video is maybe having gone to the beach or having gone to lunch with someone. It's the value of the thing that you did not do that you would have done if you weren't here. In some cases, the prices that someone actually pays for a resource or good or a service is higher or lower than the opportunity cost that all society pays. In those situations, we have a market failure. Now let's talk about one as an example that probably we can all relate to. For those of you who are at Brigham Young University, Hawaii, you know that Laie is a very small community, about 3,000 people. We're going to make an assumption about a fictitious company here in Laie and use that example to describe what an externality is and what a market failure can be. So we assume that there's no government regulations against pollution. So you and I, living in the city of Laie, can pollute as much as we want. We assume that the town has clean air. And we assume that now all of a sudden a steel mill moves into town and opens a steel producing factory and starts to emit smoke. This smoke causes respiratory diseases, causes dirtier clothes, dirty houses, dirty cars, all the things that are naturally occurring around steel mills. So the question is, who pays for that? What has happened to the clean air that we all enjoyed before the steel mill came into the community? So let's talk about the market failure. A market failure has occurred. The steel mill does not pay for the clean air. It's consumed the clean air, it took the clean air, used it in the process of making steel, and emitted dirty air. So the steel mill has used the clean air and has not paid for it. So one of its cost of production, the clean air, has spilled over to residents, you and I who live in Laie. We're the third parties because we're not getting paid by the steel mill. We're not employed by the steel mill. We are third parties to this transaction. The steel mill is making steel, using our clean air, consuming it, and returning to us dirty air, and we're the third party. Now what's happened is, because the steel mill has used this resource and has not paid us for it, they haven't paid us for our clean air that they used, because they've used a resource and haven't paid for it, their production costs are lower than they otherwise should be. Consider that if they had to pay us for the use of that clean air, their production costs would be higher than they are. So consequently, since their production costs are lower than they should be, we produce more steel than we would otherwise produce if they were paying for the clean air. So let's make a few definitions quickly. Remember, red words, and particularly red and bolded words, are words that you're going to have to learn how to define, and you're going to have to make some practical applications of those words on an exam or an assignment coming up. So the term externalities. This occurs when the consequences of an economic activity spill over to third parties. In our previous example, pollution is the externality. Third parties, these are people, individuals, parties who are not directly involved in a given activity or transaction. We as community members of Laie were not involved in the steel-making transaction. We were the third parties. We were impacted by the externality of pollution that was generated by the steel mill. This idea of property rights. It's a right of an owner to use and or exchange property. And the property rights issue is one that's particularly troublesome in this example, and we'll go into that again in a little bit more detail later. So externalities are examples of market failures. Pollution is an example of a negative externality. There are positive externalities. Inoculations, for example, and for those with very little medical background, an inoculation is nothing more than a shot. So every year, a lot of people in the United States get flu shots. And we're supposedly being inoculated or protected against the flu for that particular year. What's interesting about inoculations is if you had a room of 50 people and 25 of them were inoculated, the other 25 would very likely never get sick. So the inoculation, this shot that these 25 people get, have benefits on the other 25 in the room, even though they never paid for the inoculation. So these are external benefits. And there's peculiarities about both external costs and external benefits, and we're going to talk about those here really quickly. So consider this. In the case of the amount of steel produced every year, what happens if a firm has to now adjust for the cost of this externality? Well, whenever we think about a firm, we think about a supply curve, and what we're saying is if the firm had been producing steel without having to pay for air, it produced at this supply line here, S1. Now all of a sudden their costs go up. Now they have to pay for pollution. What happens? Well, anytime your costs go up, you're going to have decreased profit. If you're a business owner and your profits are going down, you're going to produce less. So you move from this line here, S1, to this line here, S2. So you're going to end up contracting the supply in the market because your costs have increased. Now these concepts are probably pretty well understood from our discussions in the previous chapters on supply and demand, but now you get to see it applied to a relatively real-world example. Take the same example from the inoculations. What happens? Demand is what we're concerned with here. Here we had demand at D1 where we didn't really understand the external benefits of this inoculation. Now we're going to have the inoculation provided and demand is going to go up because there are external benefits associated with this inoculation which we didn't perceive before. So let's talk about correcting for these externalities. Anytime there are externalities, there's going to be a misallocation of resources. In the case of external cost, which is the example with the pollution, there's going to be an over-allocation of steel. We're going to make more steel than the market would otherwise want because we have a resource, clean air, that we're not paying for. And so our profits are unrealistically high because we're not paying for the clean air. At the same situation with external benefits, the market tends to underallocate the inoculation because it doesn't account for the benefits for the other 25 people in the room who aren't going to get sick because the previous 25 got inoculated. Government can correct for negative externalities. In the case of pollution, we have a number of bills going before our U.S. legislature to try and put in place a pollution tax or an effluent fee or pollution trading in the United States, very similar to what we have existing in Europe now. So the government can correct for the fact that they're not paying for clean air by incurring or imposing special taxes on the steel company. And those taxes are inclined to say, if you're polluting, we're going to tax you for that pollution, and it's meant to incentivize the steel company to pollute less so that they would have to pay fewer of those taxes. In addition, the government could just regulate the industry. They could say to the steel industry, look, you can't pollute, or you can't pollute as much as you did before. This regulation would force them to produce less steel or to reduce their pollution and produce more steel. So the government has a very active role with relationship to negative externalities. What's interesting, in relationship to positive externalities, the government also can exert a very influential role. The government could say, the positive externalities of inoculations are so significant, we think that we should in some way encourage people to go get flu shots. So the government could finance the production of the flu vaccine. They could provide a subsidy for everybody who goes and gets the flu shot, they get an extra $15. They could also provide some regulation where they say all government health workers need to be inoculated. And that's a government regulation that's currently being considered by the Health Administration in the United States. There's some other interesting economic reasons for government involvement. One of which is to provide a legal system. Second, to promote competition. Third, to provide public goods, which we'll define here a little bit later. And the last one is ensuring economy-wide stability, and that's a fairly recent one. These four are all pretty important, so we're going to actually spend a few minutes going through each one. Providing a legal system. When you think about it, if you're a business owner and you enter a contract with another business to supply you some goods that you're going to be then using to make a final product and selling off to another customer, you want to make sure that those contracts can be enforced. If you are an automobile manufacturer, you need to get steel of a certain quantity and quality level so that you can make your cars. You're going to enter into a contract with a steel company to provide you that steel so that you can make your automobiles. What happens if the steel company says, we don't want to deliver the steel that we promised? There you are as the automobile company, now not having enough steel to make your cars. You need to be able to have a government that allows you to go to court and enforce the contract that you'd signed with the steel company. That's a very, very powerful form of government involvement. One that we don't often think about. But there are many countries around the world whose legal systems are so poorly developed that companies cannot depend upon their contracts being enforced. And that makes business very, very difficult. The second part of this is to define and protect property rights. Property rights are fairly easy to understand if you have a piece of property. Say you have a 10-acre piece of property and you're growing corn on that property. Your rights are to use that property as you see fit. And if somebody were to encroach on your property and start to harvest your corn and take it for themselves, you can actually take them to court and say, look, this is my property, I have rights to it, you can't infringe upon those rights. And that's one of the roles of government. The other one is to just establish some basic legal rules of behavior. how we relate to one another in business, and what our responsibilities are to shareholders, to customers, and to the general population. And the government provides all of those things under the legal structure that we operate in. The other idea that we mentioned is this idea of promoting competition. And the reason why that's a function of government is because we have this general feeling that if companies are allowed to just continue to grow without any checks, that they'll get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they'll create more and more power, and they'll do things that are not best for customers. They're not best for the population, for the people. And so the government believes that promoting competition will keep prices lower and keep opportunities higher. So we believe that anything that constrains competition isn't in itself a market failure, and that the government should step in and try and encourage competition. There's two ways that this can be looked at, one of which is through antitrust legislation, and the other one is through monopoly power. Antitrust legislation is a little bit interesting because we think of this, well, trust, why would we ever be against trust? But the name actually comes from the early days in the 1900s when some of the very large corporations in the United States started to own shares in other companies. And they had similar management teams in those companies, and they created these things called trusts. And those trusts became so powerful that they restricted the ability for individual consumers to have any power in the market. And so the government stepped in and said, we need to break up these trusts, and they created legislation that was called antitrust legislation. Now in our modern technology-filled world, we still have antitrust cases. For example, Microsoft was sued over the last few years because its market power became so strong that it limited competition in areas like browsers, in areas like word processing software, and various other things. So the government constantly keeps an eye on these markets, watches how concentrated and how powerful individual firms are in those markets, and steps in and tries to control that power to try and increase or enhance competition. Sometimes we have things called monopoly power. If you live in Laie, you know that your electricity is provided by Hawaiian Electric. They are a monopoly, and we'll talk about monopolies again in future chapters. But what that means is it's one company, and they provide all the power to everybody in the city. There isn't a competitive firm. There isn't some other option that you can turn to. And because you only have one option, the government believes that this monopoly power can be very dangerous to consumers if it's allowed to run amok. And so to keep it from running amok, the government watches those monopolies very carefully. They allow them to exist, but then they watch them very closely so that they don't take on more power than they should have. This next idea is one called public goods, and this is one that gets people a little bit confused, so let's walk through it carefully. There are some things that the uninhibited market just doesn't provide well. For example, national defense. How do you get a company to provide national defense, and how much would each of us be willing to pay for that national defense? Those are things that are difficult to assess, and the market fails in production of that particular good or service. So we talk about this idea called public goods, and that's the government providing some goods that it thinks the market would not provide, that it also believes are pretty important. So a public good is a good to which the principle of rival consumption does not apply. Let's talk about what that means. Rival consumption. If you have two people, one buys a hamburger and eats it, the other person cannot eat the hamburger. It's already been eaten. That is rival consumption. If consumed by one, it can't be consumed by another. Take those same two people. They live next door to each other in Laie. They're in the dorm rooms, and they're in the dorms next to each other. If one of them consumes national defense, the other one can also consume national defense without reducing the value of national defense. So there's this principle of rival consumption that doesn't apply to national defense, which makes it, as a category, a public good. So anytime rival consumption does not apply, that particular good or service could be provided by the government and could possibly be a public good. By contrast, private goods can be consumed by one individual at a time and not be consumed by the other. So the principle of rival consumption is a critical element of all public goods discussions. Public goods can be jointly consumed by many individuals simultaneously. Some other characteristics of public goods are the exclusion principle. Since a good can be used by more people at no additional opportunity cost, it's very difficult to exclude them. If those two people living in the adjoining dorm rooms, one is consuming national defense and the other one says, I don't really care about national defense. How do we exclude that person from national defense? Because if the airplane is flying over one dorm room to protect them, it's flying over the other one as well. So how do we exclude? It's hard to exclude. So the two dominant principles of public goods are they are non-excludable and they are non-rival. So on economic terminology, those are the two conditions that make a public good. The exclusion principle also leads to this idea called a free rider. And that was our second person in the dorm room who said, I don't care about national defense, so I'm not going to pay for it. But he's still getting defended because the plane is flying over his dorm room as well as the person who values national defense, and so he's a free rider. There's another very interesting example of the free rider problem that occurred during the Cold War. Most of you are too young to remember this, but when I was your age, we had regular weekly exercises where we practiced hiding under our desks in fear of what we considered to be an absolute eventual outcome where Russia was going to send missiles over and bomb us. Now, when you think about it, knowing where Russia is compared to the United States, if they were going to send missiles to the United States, they're going to have to some way fly over Canada. So we created this system with Canada where we said, you know what, we're going to put in place a protection system that protects the United States from these missiles. You, Canada, are going to be part of that, so we think that you should pay for some of that. Canada said, good, we're good for that. We don't have the technology. We appreciate you doing it. We'll pay for a piece of that. And then a few years later, the Canadians said, well, you know what? If the planes or the missiles have to fly over Canada to get to America, then you're going to protect us anyway. So why should we pay for it? So the Canadians stopped paying for it. And the United States indeed kept paying for it. And by virtue of the fact that they had to fly over Canada anyway, we protected the Canadian airspace for free. And Canada became a free rider. Anytime you have the inability to exclude someone from consuming a particular good, you have this free rider problem. Now, there's some other very interesting aspects of government functions, one of which is this idea called ensuring economy-wide stability. Now, this is fairly new. It really came out of World War II, or the end of World War II, when you had a situation where you'd been making tanks and guns and boats and planes to satisfy the war effort, and now all of a sudden, there's peace. And you've got millions of soldiers who are going to be coming back to the United States, and you need to find a way to put them to work. Now, when the soldiers went to war, their wives and sisters who did not go to war went to the factories to create all these products. Now, after the war, the wives and sisters said, you know, we sort of like working. We like making our own paycheck and enjoying the freedom that creates. So we don't want to go back to the house. We'd rather stay working. The men came back from war and there weren't a lot of jobs. And so the government said, we need to do something to make this work. So they created the Full Employment Act of 1946, where they said the government's role is threefold. One of which is to ensure full employment. Second is to ensure price stability, which means very low inflation. And the third one is to sponsor and encourage economic growth so that the economy continues to grow over time. This is a fairly new departure. We hadn't done this before. Previously, we just said, the market will figure it out. During the war, the government stepped in and said, we really need the market to do these things, and it worked pretty well. So we figured after the war that the government could stay involved, and maybe things would be better than they were before. And we figured that with this kind of government involvement, maybe those cycles of up and down that we had in previous economies would flatten out a little bit, and we wouldn't have them so much. So since 1946, since World War II, the government has been more active than they had been previously. Now the government's producing goods, and their government goods come in two broad categories. One are merit goods and one are demerit goods. Government-sponsored goods that are merit goods are things like museums. The government says, we think museums are good. But naturally, the market's not going to produce museums and charge a price that people can pay to be able to go see them. So we're going to sponsor those goods and we're going to encourage them. Those are called merit goods. If you drive up to Sunset Beach, you'll see a community center up there that is almost never being used. That's a merit good. The government said, I think we need more community centers. And so they paid for community centers to be built and did so under the assumption that if community centers were built, more people would use them, more people would get to know each other, communities would be closer knit, there would be less crime. All these things are good things. Those are merit goods. Demerit goods are a little bit different. Demerit goods are things that the government said, now the market provides these things, but we don't think they're good. Smoking is a demerit good. Illegal drugs, these are demerit goods. These are goods that the government says are socially undesirable. So the government does things necessary to restrict the use of those type of goods and services. Now let's talk about some other functions of government. In particular, most of you are students at BYU Hawaii, and some of you are receiving government funding, government support for being a student. That's one of government's roles. It's not necessarily one that is inherent in economics, but inherent in social policy. That is a role of income redistribution, which means someone else has made the income and has been taxed, goes to the government, and then is redistributed to you as a student because you don't make enough money, but the government says education is pretty important. So the government is willing to tax someone's income, take it away from them, and give it to you as a student so you can go to school. This income redistribution idea includes a progressive tax system and a bunch of transfers of payments. So we have two categories in here that are red terms and bolded. One is called transfer payments and one is called transfers in kind, and we'll hit both of these independently. Transfer payments, this is just a money payment made by governments to individuals for which there's no services or goods rendered. If you are a poor family and you receive food stamps, then that could be considered a transfer. But what kind of transfer is it? It's not a transfer payment because you're being forced to take food. Examples of transfer payments are Social Security for old age and disability payments, unemployment insurance that you receive when you lose your job. Payments or transfers in kind are different. These are payments that are provided in the form of goods and services. This is where food stamps are involved, because when you get a food stamp, it is not just here's cash, go use it wherever you would like. It's here is a food stamp when now it's on a card that allows you to go and buy milk, eggs, butter, a certain number of particular products. Subsidized public housing, where they actually give you housing at a cheaper price. Medical care. These are all transfers in kind. So government functions that allow you to receive monetary reward could be transfers of money or transfers in kind. Now let's talk about government outlays. Government spends a lot of money. Federal, state, local spending is enormous. When you think about what your tax rate is, right now you're a student, so you're not making very much money, but think about your parents. Most of your parents are probably doing pretty well. They have a 35% federal tax bracket, which means 35% of their income is paid in federal taxes. In most cases, the states also have an income tax, and so you have another 2 to 3% state income tax. And then you have another 10% sales tax, and you have another 8% Social Security tax. So when you start adding all of these taxes, one on top of another, you realize that the government takes a significant portion of your income in taxes. Let's talk about what it does with those taxes. It spends them. Government doesn't make money. Government makes no money. The government takes the money from the customers, which are the citizens. It is taking away money that you have made. So think about it. When you think about this in your daily life, the government doesn't make any money. If you're receiving government payments for food stamps or for education, you're getting money that has been taken from somebody else. So spend it carefully. Examples of government outlays include defense, income security, Social Security. These are federal levels. Most educational expenses, healthcare expenses, hospital expenses, public welfare, are made at the state level. But these are the dominant government outlays. When you look at government outlays as they've appeared over time, you can see that the graph has a continual trajectory going upward. We have this period where things went really high for a while. This was the Great Depression. But they've continued to move upward. And then we have the situation where we're currently in, where the government spending has increased significantly. If this graph were closer to present, what you'd see here is that this has now exceeded significantly the position that we were in during the Great Depression, largely driven by the most recent financial crisis. Where we get our money from and where we spend it is pretty important. But what you need to realize is that where government spending comes from separates into both federal and state and local. And they do different things. What we do with our federal spending, which is in this pie chart, is totally different than what we do with our state spending, which is in this pie chart. And generally know that federal spending and state spending are different and where the categories are, and you'll be prepared to answer any questions on that. This idea called collective decision making. What is that? It sounds and feels like the market. It's how voters, politicians, other interested parties act, and how these actions influence non-market decisions. So collective decision making is how we vote. And in general, we assume that we have similar ideas that we do in the market. You know, the rational decision making paradigm that we talked about from the market is that people won't do things, won't make decisions that will make themselves worse off. We assume that our voting decisions, our voting ideas, do the same thing, that we always will vote in a way that will make us better off. The theory of public choice is based upon this collective decision-making model. It assumes that individuals act within the political process to maximize their individual well-being. That when we vote, we're not going to go into the voting booth and vote for someone who's going to penalize us or going to make us worse off. Consequently, when presidents run for election, they do so by saying how they're going to do these wonderful things for us to make us better off. And in general, we vote for the candidate who we think is going to make us the best off. All right, so there's great similarities between the market and public sector's decision making. We assume that we're self-interested. We assume that we can analyze the market and opportunity cost of individual choices. We assume generally that competition is better, and we assume that individuals are fairly similar, but different in incentive structures. Remember we talked about incentives before? Incentive structure is the system of rewards and punishments that individuals face with respect to their individual actions. Differences between market and collective decision making are significant, even though we assume that the individual motivations of an individual are rational and self-interested. Government goods are assumed to be given at a zero price. You don't pay anything for your national defense, even though you're taxed for it. They have an ability to force us to do things. If we don't do them, they can put us in jail. Instead of spending and using the market as the determinant for what we want, we use our voting. And the problem with that is when we use our money, the market signal is sent immediately. When we use voting, the signals are fairly delayed. Things may take years to occur. And so there's not a direct result from voting to achieving the objectives that we were looking for. There's additional differences between market and collective decision-making, voting versus spending, the political system versus the market system. We typically run by majority rule, which says 50% wins. If you've noticed in the U.S. Political process over the last 20 years, we have a very, very close race on most major issues. For example, when Barack Obama won the last election, he won by a few percentage points. And we in the United States consider that a landslide. However, when you think about it, there were over 46% of the population who did not vote for Barack Obama as president. And so we do most of our decisions by majority rule. And when the majority rule is close, in other words, you're close to a 50-50 vote discrepancy, there's a lot of people who didn't agree. By contrast, the market system is run by proportional rule. In the proportion who votes for a specific product or service gets that product or service. So those are important issues and concepts to keep in mind. We've talked about some of the differences between market and collective decision-making processes, and this is the idea that really finishes out this chapter. And we want you to understand that the government is actively involved in the markets today, and that is not going to change anytime soon. The degree to which the government is involved, that may change from one political party to another or one candidate to another, but the government is going to remain involved. And that is a process that just continues to grow year by year by year. In the next chapters, we'll start talking about how government gets its money and how that money is collected, how that money is calculated. But for this chapter is ended, and hopefully you've enjoyed it and understood it well. Feel free to review this over and over and again to make sure that you understand it.